I still remember the day we drove into Sycamore Heights with all our belongings packed into a beat-up moving van. The sweet smell of pine drifted through the open window, and the air felt fresh, carrying the warmth of early summer. My husband, Oliver, steered carefully, trying not to scrape the van's sides against the neatly trimmed hedges lining the pristine, winding streets. Behind us, our teenage daughter, Ella, craned her neck to take in the rows of elegant houses perched on tidy lawns. As we turned onto Chestnut Drive, a grand sign caught my eye. Welcome to Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, a place where neighbors become family. At first glance, everything looked idyllic. Large oak and maple trees offered shady canopies, and blooming flower beds lined each driveway, as if an invisible committee had arranged them for maximum curb appeal. We passed houses painted in tasteful, uniform shades. A sense of order reigned, a promise, perhaps, of a peaceful life where people took pride in their surroundings. We pulled into our new driveway, house number 34, a brick two-story with dark shutters and a wraparound porch. The landscaping out front was lush but meticulously maintained, suggesting that the previous owners had kept pace with the HOA standards. Even then, I felt a faint flutter of anxiety at the thought of living in such a regulated environment. I'd heard stories about overzealous HOAs, but it couldn't be that bad, right? Oliver killed the engine, and Ella jumped out to stretch. I heard the hum of a nearby lawnmower, the chirp of birds. Everything felt simultaneously cozy and a little too perfect. I reminded myself we'd made this move to find a quieter life, away from the chaos of our old neighborhood. As we began unloading boxes, a figure appeared on the sidewalk, tall, with coiffed salt and pepper hair, wearing a crisp, pastel blouse and slacks. She carried a clipboard in the crook of her arm. Her steps were deliberate, each footfall echoing confidence. I smiled, thinking she might be coming to welcome us. "Hello," I ventured. "We're just moving in." She offered a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome to Sycamore Heights. I'm Bernadette Arnolson, but everyone calls me Karen." She paused, as though waiting for the significance of that nickname to settle in. "I'm on the HOA board here. I thought I'd come introduce myself." Her tone was sugary, but had an undercurrent of authority. I noticed her gaze slide over the boxes, the van's open doors, even the potted plants we'd brought, as if taking inventory. A prickle of unease formed in my stomach. I forced a friendly grin. "Nice to meet you. I'm Valerie, and this is my husband, Oliver." Karen gave us each a nod, then turned to examine the porch railing. "That shade of off-white, is that the original color, or do you plan on repainting?" Oliver and I exchanged glances. "We haven't really thought about it," he said. "We just got here." Karen pursed her lips, jotting something on her clipboard. "Right," she said. "Well, when you settle in, you can check the HOA color guidelines. We prefer everything to remain consistent." A small knot tightened in my chest. This was my introduction to Sycamore Heights. Not a plate of cookies or a handshake, but a pointed remark about paint color. In that moment, I had no idea just how far Karen's meddling would go, or how she would one day put our entire family's safety at risk. Over the following weeks, we tried to adapt to the rhythms of Sycamore Heights. There were rules for everything. The grass had to be no longer than 3 inches. Trash cans had to be brought to the curb after 6 in the morning and retrieved by 6 in the evening on garbage days. The mailbox design had to match the neighborhood standard, right down to the size of the numbers. All of this was spelled out in a thick binder titled Sycamore Heights, Rules and Regulations. Karen presided over many of these guidelines. She wasn't the official president of the HOA, merely a board member in charge of standards compliance, but it often felt as if she ran the entire show. She sent out weekly email bulletins, highlighting any violations she had noticed. It became a ritual. Every Monday morning, I'd find a digitally scanned memo reminding everyone about noise ordinances or complaining about kids playing basketball on the street past 8 p.m. At first, I tried to comply without fuss. Oliver rolled his eyes at the more outlandish demands, but he also wanted to keep the peace. Ella laughed about the fussy neighborhood lady, even as she bristled when Karen marched up to her once and demanded she stop skateboarding in the driveway because it was unsightly. Despite Karen's constant vigilance, we found some pleasant aspects of Sycamore Heights. We met neighbors who were kind and generous, a retired couple who shared homegrown tomatoes, a young family with twin toddlers who invited us over for a barbecue. There was an undercurrent of community spirit that Karen's rigid rules couldn't snuff out. But each time we felt comfortable, Karen found a new reason to assert her presence. Whether it was her appearing at our front door to inquire about a suspect bird feeder or sending a polite but pointed note about the permissible size of welcome mats, she was always there. Everything had to be exactly how she imagined it. I tried telling myself that she was just a stickler, but I sensed that her need for control went deeper. Karen seemed to thrive on the power she wielded. Any minor deviation gave her license to remind people of her authority. Little did I know, her meddling was about to intensify, and in a way that could have cost us more than a simple fine. It all came to a head one afternoon when Oliver was at work. I was in the backyard weeding our modest vegetable patch, and Ella was at the local library. Suddenly, I heard Karen's voice floating over the fence, laced with disapproval. "Valerie," she called, "could you come out front for a moment?" Alarmed, I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans, and made my way around the house. Karen stood at the curb beside a neatly trimmed shrub, her arms folded across her clipboard. "Yes?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She gestured toward our driveway. "Your car, this gray sedan, seems to be leaking something." She pointed to a small dark spot on the concrete. I frowned. "I'll check on it. Might just be condensation from the air conditioner or an oil drip." In any case, it wasn't a big, egregious spill, just a couple of small spots, easily cleaned. Karen handed me a folded piece of paper. "It's a notice from the HOA. We have strict guidelines on property cleanliness. I'm afraid you'll need to have this removed by tomorrow or risk a small fine." I stared at the notice, frustration swelling inside me. "You wrote up a formal notice for a drip?" Karen's eyebrows rose. "All vehicles should be well maintained. Excessive leaks create stains. Stains degrade property values." I clenched my teeth. "Excessive leaks? It's a couple drops. I'll clean them. You don't need to file an official notice." Her posture was rigid, unwavering. "I'm just doing my duty. Sycamore Heights prides itself on a pristine environment. Surely you understand." I wanted to argue that a few oil drips wouldn't tank property values, but I recognized the futility of reasoning with her. She wanted compliance, not conversation. "Fine," I managed. "I'll take care of it." Karen gave a curt nod, pivoted on her heel, and strode back toward her house. That was our first real showdown. It ended with a piece of paper that labeled me a violator in my own driveway. I swallowed a bitter lump of resentment. For all my attempts to be a good neighbor, it felt like I was being policed by an overzealous hall monitor. Even then, I had no inkling that one day Karen would go beyond petty notices and trivial citations. But that ominous sense that something bigger was brewing remained. The summer days lengthened, humidity thick in the air. Life fell into a pattern of small tensions, with Karen popping up to quell anything that ruffled her sense of order. We learned to keep our grass trimmed religiously, to store our trash bins with military precision, and to politely wave whenever she passed, if only to keep her from digging too deeply into our lives. Then, in mid-July, a wave of scorching heat descended upon the region. Temperatures soared, stretching the local fire department thin as they dealt with brush fires and overheated AC units going up in smoke. Our neighborhood, with its manicured lawns and carefully spaced houses, seemed safe from such threats, until it wasn't. One blistering afternoon, Oliver was in the living room reading, Ella was upstairs tinkering with her guitar, and I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. The air conditioner groaned, struggling against the relentless heat. Then I smelled it, an acrid, smoky odor drifting through the vents. My stomach lurched. "Do you smell that?" I called to Oliver. He stood up, sniffing at the air. "Yeah, it's definitely smoke." My mind raced. I checked the stove. Nothing was burning. I rushed to the hallway, opening the door to the garage. A haze of thick, gray smoke billowed out. My heart leapt into my throat. "Fire!" I yelled to my family. "Get out! Call 911. Ella bolted from her room, phone in hand, panic etched on her face. Oliver ran for the front door. I scrambled to turn off the main electricity switch in the garage, though the haze was blinding and my lungs stung. The moment I realized the flames were near our old stack of paint cans, I abandoned the attempt and fled, coughing violently. We gathered on the sidewalk, the heat radiating behind us like a dragon's breath. It felt surreal. My home, The place we had so carefully maintained was under siege by an unstoppable threat. Ella clung to me, tears in her eyes, and Oliver cradled her shoulders. We could see the flicker of flames from under the garage door now. I dialed 911, my hands shaking. The dispatcher assured me that a fire engine was en route. We could do nothing but wait, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear Ella's sobs. Neighbors began to emerge from their houses. Some rushed to us, offering comfort and calling out to see if we needed anything. A few braver souls ran to grab garden hoses, though I knew it was dangerous to attempt to fight a fire without proper gear. Minutes ticked by like hours, the roar of the flames intensifying. Smoke curled into the sky. Then, at last, we heard the sirens, the distinct wail of a fire truck approaching. Relief welled up inside me, tears stinging my eyes again. My house might still be saved, but that relief was short-lived. The red lights flashed in the distance. Within seconds, the fire truck turned onto Chestnut Drive, sirens blaring. Firefighters, decked in protective gear, prepared to rush into action. But as the truck neared our house, we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, arms raised. It was Karen. For a split second, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. She was literally blocking the fire truck, standing there like a traffic warden with the authority to stop them. Smoke continued to pour from our garage, the flames visible through the windows, but she didn't budge. "What is she doing?" Oliver shouted in disbelief. I sprinted toward Karen, yelling for her to move. One of the firefighters leaned out the window, his expression incredulous. "Ma'am, get out of the way," he roared over the engine's rumble and the wailing sirens. Karen held up one hand. "Wait, this vehicle is not authorized to enter without proper clearance. We have rules in Sycamore Heights about large service vehicles, especially heavy equipment that can damage our roads." My jaw dropped. Was she serious? My house was on fire, and she was worried about the weight limit on the pavement? "Move," I cried, pointing to the thick black smoke billowing from my garage. "Karen, my house is burning down." She turned, mouth set in a prim line. "I sympathize, but the HOA guidelines specifically state that emergency vehicles must use designated access points or show advance permission when entering the community." "Are you insane? This is a fire truck," a neighbor shouted. "They have every right to be here." The lead firefighter, stepping down from the engine, stormed toward Karen, his gear jingling. "Ma'am, we have a 911 call about a structure fire, which means we don't need authorization to respond. Get out of the road, or we'll have you forcibly removed." Karen's eyes flashed with indignation. She crossed her arms, but the mention of forced removal seemed to break her nerve. Finally, she stepped aside just enough for the truck to pass. I couldn't believe it. My phone was still in my hand, and without thinking, I switched it to record mode. The entire confrontation, the truck trying to inch past Karen, the firefighters yelling, was captured on video. My hands trembled as I realized the magnitude of her actions. If she delayed them any longer, the blaze could have spread past the garage into the living quarters. The second the truck cleared Karen, the firefighters leapt into action, unspooling hoses, directing water onto the flames, breaking windows to vent the smoke. I stumbled back, adrenaline roaring in my ears. Ella clutched my arm, stunned by what we had witnessed. Over the next critical minutes, the crew fought the fire with all their skill and might. And Karen? She stood off to the side, as though waiting to scold them for stepping on her prize azaleas. Inside the house, smoke seethed through every corridor, but the firefighters managed to focus on the garage first, since that was the point of ignition. They broke down part of the garage door, letting out a cloud of choking gray, then began dousing the flames with powerful streams of water. Another team circled to the side door, axes at the ready. By now, half the neighborhood had gathered, forming a ring of anxious faces and murmured prayers. Some offered to help direct traffic or guide the firefighters to the nearest hydrant. A few neighbors gave me supportive pats on the shoulder, one even handing me a bottle of cold water for Ella. The sense of community in a crisis was palpable, except for Karen, who paced nearby, her face twisted in equal parts anger and something resembling panic. I kept recording sporadically whenever I remembered to press the button. My mind was torn between worry for our house and outrage at Karen's actions. The scorching sun and the flames' heat combined, making the air oppressive. But within half an hour, the main blaze subsided under the steady, disciplined assault of the fire crew. Eventually, an older firefighter strode over to Oliver and me, pulling down his respirator. Soot smudged his face. "We got it under control," he said, panting slightly. "Looks like the bulk of the damage is in the garage and part of the attic. The main living areas are mostly intact. Smoke damage, though? You'll need a thorough inspection and cleanup." Relief surged through me. I nodded, too choked up to speak. Ella buried her face against Oliver's chest, trying to hide her tears. Even in the midst of the shock, gratitude flooded my heart. Our home wasn't a total loss. The swift response of these brave men and women had prevented a full-scale tragedy. But when the firefighter asked how the fire started, I felt a pang of guilt. "We had some old paint cans and maybe a malfunction in our water heater," I explained. We should have cleared out the flammable materials. "I'm so sorry." He waved off my apology. "Happens more often than you'd think. Just be glad you called us when you did." I glanced over at Karen, who hovered a few yards away, arms crossed, lip curled. The lead firefighter fixed her with a hard stare. She seemed momentarily cowed, as though uncertain whether to approach or retreat. Eventually, she walked up to us, trying on a thin smile. "I'm relieved you're all right," she said. "But, Valerie, you understand we must keep our roads safe." "Stop talking," Oliver snapped. I'd never heard him use that tone before. Cold, furious, and final. Karen's mouth snapped shut, her cheeks coloring. The older firefighter, seeing the tension, reached for his radio. "Ma'am, if you have any issues, you can take them up with the city. But right now, blocking emergency vehicles is a criminal offense in some jurisdictions." Karen, face flushed, avoided his gaze. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her house. My camera was still rolling, capturing every step of her huffy retreat. A wave of exhaustion hit me all at once. My house was partially charred, waterlogged, and reeking of smoke, but we had been spared the worst. I held Ella close, ignoring the dull ache of resentment that threatened to overwhelm me. Karen's bizarre stunt would not overshadow the fact that our family was safe. That night, we stayed with a generous neighbor, the same one who'd given us tomatoes weeks earlier. Our entire house was deemed unsafe for immediate occupancy until professionals could assess structural damage. While we were grateful for the neighbor's kindness, it was hard not to replay the horrifying image of Karen blocking the fire truck in my head. Ella was quiet, helping me rummage through phone chargers and clothing changes we'd hastily salvaged. When we finally had a moment alone, she said, "Mom, I can't believe Karen actually stood in front of the firefighters like that. What if they'd been too late?" I swallowed hard, hugging her. "I know, honey. We're lucky they got there in time," and pushed past her nonsense. Oliver joined us, face grim. He'd spent the last half hour on the phone with our insurance company, explaining the situation. The agent expressed incredulity that someone had deliberately impeded the emergency response. It certainly wouldn't help the paperwork side of things. "What are we going to do about Karen?" Oliver asked quietly. "She almost cost us our home." I thought of the video on my phone. I'd watched it once already, my anger flaring anew as I listened to Karen's voice demanding authorization. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not letting it slide. That was dangerous and criminal." Oliver nodded. "We have evidence. The firefighters can vouch for it too." A knot of tension formed in my chest. I knew we could submit the footage to the authorities, or at least file a complaint. Still, part of me dreaded the inevitable blowback if we confronted Karen publicly. This was her kingdom, so to speak. She was deeply entrenched in the HOA. The last thing I wanted was a drawn-out war, especially when we were already reeling from the fire. But ignoring it felt impossible. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the worst-case scenarios. If the truck had been delayed just a few minutes longer, we might have lost the entire house. Or one of the firefighters could have been hurt. As the clock crept toward dawn, I resolved that I would not brush aside Karen's reckless power play. I owed it to my family, to our safety, to do something. The next morning, the fire inspector arrived to examine the aftermath. He took pictures, noted where the paint cans had been stored, and concluded that a combination of an electrical short and the flammable materials had triggered the blaze. "You got lucky," he said softly. "Could have been worse if the flames reached your main fuel line." I thanked him, shuddering at the thought. Soon after, the local police came by, an officer named Martinez, to file a routine report. They wanted to confirm no foul play had been involved. Before he left, I gathered my courage. "Officer, I'd like to tell you about something that happened when the fire truck arrived." Martinez looked up from his paperwork. "Yes." I described the incident in detail, how Karen had blocked the fire truck, demanding authorization. I even showed him the video on my phone. He watched, his brow furrowing. "This is unusual," he said, exhaling slowly when the footage ended. "I know the firefighters already mentioned it in their notes. They said a neighborhood official tried to interfere, but they left the specifics for the police to handle if needed. So you'll do something about it?" Oliver asked, voice taut. Officer Martinez hesitated. "The trouble is, it's technically a misdemeanor to obstruct emergency services, but only if the prosecutor deems it's in the public's interest to press charges. Typically, these cases revolve around someone physically preventing the truck from passing or ignoring repeated warnings to clear out. Your video shows that she delayed them, but it didn't escalate to them calling for backup or forcibly removing her." I felt my frustration boil. "So you're saying she might walk away scot-free?" Martinez lifted a placating hand. "Not necessarily. At the very least, I can file a complaint and forward this evidence to the district attorney. If the DA decides to pursue it, they'll contact you. Or you can hire a lawyer to push it. Either way, her actions are definitely on record." Though not a resounding guarantee, it was something. I handed Officer Martinez a copy of the video, along with statements from 2 neighbors who had witnessed the blockade. He thanked me, gave me a card with his contact information, and headed off. Later that afternoon, Oliver and I walked through the charred remains of the garage. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Tools, shelves, and holiday decorations had been reduced to blackened ruin. My eyes welled with tears. It was a painful sight. We heard a rustle and turned to see Karen standing at the edge of our driveway. She looked uneasy, arms stiff at her sides. For a moment, I wondered if she had come to apologize. But the hardness in her gaze told me otherwise. "I see you're talking to the authorities," she said. "I hope we can all be neighborly about this. It's unfortunate that your property lacked the proper safety measures, but this is a private community. We have a certain image to uphold." I stared at her, speechless. She was pinning the blame on us for the fire damage to keep the HOA's image intact. Oliver's fury broke through. "My wife nearly lost her life in that garage. Our daughter could have been in there. And you blocked the fire truck. If we'd had a few more minutes of delay, we'd have lost the entire house. Or someone might have died." Karen pursed her lips, ignoring Oliver's anger. "I'll be discussing matters with the rest of the board. This negative publicity is not what we want. We expect you to keep this discreet." Blood roared in my ears. I'd never been so close to screaming in someone's face. Instead, I took a measured breath. "We submitted the footage as evidence to the police." Karen's eyes flashed. "You what?" "You heard me," I said. "They have the video, and so does the local fire department. If you're worried about your precious reputation, maybe you should have moved out of the way instead of playing traffic cop with a burning house." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. She spun on her heel and stomped away, leaving Oliver and me shaking with residual adrenaline. We stood there in the rubble, hearts pounding, uncertain of what would happen next, but resolute in our decision. Word spread fast that we had involved the police. A few neighbors expressed quiet relief, saying it was about time someone reined in Karen's overreach. Others looked uneasy, worried that we were igniting a feud that could engulf the entire community. But Oliver and I believed we were doing the right thing. No one should have to face a blocked fire truck during a life-or-death emergency. About a week after the incident, we received an email. Sycamore Heights, HOA board meeting. Urgent agenda item, community safety protocols. It was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Despite the chaos of dealing with insurance adjusters, contractors, and the looming question of where we would temporarily live, Oliver and I decided we had to attend. If they were going to address community safety, we suspected the main topic would be Karen's interference. The night of the meeting, we entered the HOA's clubhouse, a small, bright building near the entrance of the neighborhood. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the board members sat. About 20 residents were already there, some glancing our way with sympathetic nods. Karen, seated at the far left, tapped her pen on the table, her expression stony. The board president, Mr. Holloway, cleared his throat and began. "Good evening, everyone. We have a serious matter to discuss. As many of you know, we recently had a fire at the home of Oliver and Valerie Harrison. We're relieved no one was injured, and the house didn't sustain total damage. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Mr. Holloway continued. However, there have been allegations, supported by video evidence, that one of our board members, Ms. Arnoldson, obstructed the fire department's response. Karen's gaze flicked around the room, spine rigid. She held her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. Now, Mr. Holloway said, we must clarify. The HOA does not condone blocking emergency vehicles. There's no association rule that overrides state or local law for first responders. We don't have a separate authorization procedure for them, nor have we ever had one in the past. He paused, looking pointedly at Karen. Ms. Arnoldson, would you like to speak on this matter? Karen inhaled sharply. She stood, smoothing her blouse with an air of faux composure. Certainly. First, let me say that I'm deeply sorry the Harrisons experienced a fire. However, I'd like to clarify the context of my actions. We've had issues with unauthorized vehicles damaging our roads. I was merely ensuring that the drivers had clearance. In the confusion of the moment, things escalated. Perhaps I was misunderstood. I bit back a scoff. The gall of her to claim misunderstanding after what we'd witnessed. One of the other board members, a stout woman named Denise, raised her voice. I've seen the footage, Karen. The firefighters repeatedly told you to stand aside. You even mentioned something about how their vehicle was too large and might crack the pavement. That's not a misunderstanding. It's an obstruction. Karen's face reddened. I was concerned about potential liabilities to the HOA. If the road is damaged, it affects all of us. I didn't realize how severe the fire was. That's all. How could you not realize? A neighbor exclaimed from the back. There was smoke everywhere. A small uproar started, with several residents voicing frustration at Karen's priorities. Mr. Holloway had to slam his gavel to restore order. Then he turned to me. Valerie, do you have anything you want to say? All eyes turned in my direction. My stomach nodded, but I forced myself to speak calmly. Yes, I have to stress that my family was in real danger. The fire could have spread in minutes. Karen's actions, intentional or not, put our lives and property at risk. That's unacceptable. Another neighbor chimed in. What if it had been a medical emergency, and she refused an ambulance? That set off another round of hushed exclamations. Karen pressed her lips together, looking like she might snap her pen in half. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat again. We will take a formal vote among the board members to decide if Ms. Arnoldson's behavior warrants disciplinary measures within the HOA structure. He shot her a hard look. Additionally, local authorities are also examining whether her obstruction was legally actionable. We will await their findings. Karen sank into her seat, eyes flashing with anger and humiliation. A heavy tension weighed on the room. I knew this was far from the end of the ordeal, but at least the community had spoken up. In the days following the HOA meeting, Karen became the talk of Sycamore Heights. Neighbors whispered in driveways and over fences, recounting the story of how she'd blocked the fire truck. More and more people approached us, apologizing that we'd had to deal with such blatant recklessness. Others expressed worry about how the ongoing investigation would affect property values, an irony that didn't escape me, given that Karen's main obsession was preserving those same values. Meanwhile, Karen refused to back down. She continued sending out her usual bulletins about lawn care and mailbox uniformity. But the tone had shifted. Neighbors now openly questioned her credentials and motives. Rumor had it that some board members were pressuring her to step down. She clung to her seat, though, perhaps out of stubborn pride. To complicate matters, we were still dealing with contractors and insurance. The garage was a gutted shell. Smoke had infiltrated the living room ceiling. For weeks, we lived in a hotel near Oliver's office, waiting on the green light to move back in once the house was habitable. One afternoon, I stopped by the property to meet with a contractor. I wanted to see how the cleanup progressed. The blackened timbers smelled of ash, but at least the worst debris had been cleared away. As I stepped outside to get some air, who should appear on the sidewalk but Karen, arms folded, eyebrows drawn. Valerie, she began, her voice carrying that signature superiority. I'd appreciate if you kept your contractors mindful of the noise restrictions. Some neighbors have complained about early morning drilling. I stared at her. It's 9 a.m. on a weekday. They're allowed to work during these hours. We have a house to rebuild. Karen sniffed. Still, the HOA guidelines. Karen, I interjected, all patience gone. I have a gaping hole in my garage. My family is living out of a hotel, and you're worried about how the noise might inconvenience people." She straightened, a tight smile forming. "We all have to consider each other's comfort, Valerie. If you can't follow the rules, I'll have to issue a formal notice." Any retort died on my lips as I realized just how deeply she believed in her own righteousness. She'd risked my family's home by delaying the fire truck, and still she was issuing petty threats. My hands shook with anger, but I simply turned and walked back inside, letting the contractor's whirring equipment drown out her parting words. That evening, as we piled into our hotel room, exhausted, sweaty from a day of salvaging items from the house, my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see Officer Martinez's number. Heart jolting, I answered. "Good evening, Miss Harrison," he said. "I'm calling to let you know we've concluded our initial investigation into Ms. Arnoldson's actions during your house fire." I gestured for Oliver to join me, setting the call on speaker. "What's the news?" "Well, the district attorney is reviewing the evidence. The firefighters' statements confirm she was obstructive, but not for a prolonged duration. They were able to reach your property quickly after confronting her. So whether it rises to criminal obstruction is a gray area. However," he added, a note of seriousness in his voice, "the city council and the local fire chief aren't taking this lightly. She may face a separate citation or formal reprimand for interfering with emergency services." Oliver exhaled slowly. "So, does that mean fines or some legal consequence?" "It could mean a citation or a penalty for public endangerment," Martinez replied. "But that's up to the city's legal counsel. In the meantime, you might consider talking to a lawyer if you want to pursue civil action. At the very least, Ms. Arnoldson's record will reflect this incident." I thanked the officer for the update. After we hung up, Ella, who'd been listening from the other side of the room, asked, "So she won't go to jail or anything?" "It doesn't look like it," Oliver answered, ruffling her hair. "But maybe she'll face some consequences." Ella frowned. "If she'd cost us the house, I bet she'd be more than just reprimanded. She's so lucky the firefighters got there in time. I'm so mad at her." I pulled my daughter into a hug. "I know, but we did what we could. We have the footage in their hands now. The rest is up to the system." She nodded, but her eyes brimmed with bitterness. I couldn't blame her. Deep down, I felt a raw sense of injustice as well. We had undeniable proof of Karen's wrongdoing, yet the outcome seemed uncertain. However, I had no intention of dropping the matter quietly. If local authorities wouldn't punish her severely, perhaps the HOA would, or the general public outcry would force her to realize she wasn't untouchable. While the legal side took its course, public sentiment in Sycamore Heights turned squarely against Karen. People began posting on the neighborhood's social media forum, a private group once dominated by her official announcements. Now, residents openly criticized her behavior. Some recounted past run-ins, describing how she had tried to keep an ambulance from driving across the grass at the community park to reach a man having a heart attack. It turned out the paramedics ignored her that time, too, but no one had documented it as thoroughly. Others chimed in about how she penalized them for minor aesthetic violations or threatened them with fines for momentary infractions. A collective resentment came boiling to the surface. Karen had, for years, cultivated an image of being the ultimate enforcer, never hesitating to pounce on small missteps. The fire truck incident shattered whatever veneer of civic responsibility she'd claimed. Meanwhile, the HOA board mulled over possible disciplinary measures. A censure? Removal from her position on the board? Some members wanted her gone altogether, fearing that her actions could open the HOA to lawsuits. Others worried about a backlash from her allies, though it became harder to find who those allies were, as few wanted to align themselves with someone who would hamper a life-saving emergency response. During this tense period, Oliver and I found ourselves at the center of attention. Neighbors dropped by to offer moral support or practical help with house repairs. People apologized for Karen's behavior, though it wasn't their fault. I spent more time than I cared to, repeating the story of how we'd discovered the fire and how we'd captured the video of Karen blocking the truck. Each retelling ignited fresh anger, but also reaffirmed how close we had come to tragedy. At the same time, contractors hammered away at our damaged garage, tearing out moldy drywall, installing new studs, and working to ensure the structure was sound. The smell of soot lingered on our belongings. Every day, we took stock of what was salvageable and what had been reduced to charred debris. It was an exhausting process, physically and emotionally. Karen, for her part, seemed to double down. One day I spotted her patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard, snapping photos of houses she deemed out of compliance. It was surreal, like she was determined to prove her authority hadn't diminished. But I sensed a growing isolation around her. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid interactions. Some whispered to us that she'd approached them with desperate explanations, insisting that everything was a misunderstanding or that she had the community's best interests at heart. No one was buying it anymore. About 3 weeks after the fire, just as we were starting to move a few rescued items back into the partially repaired house, we received a letter from City Hall. The envelope bore an official seal, and the return address was the Office of Public Safety and Code Enforcement. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it. Dear Ms. Harrison, we acknowledge the evidence you submitted regarding the obstruction of emergency services during the July 15th incident at your residence. After a thorough review, the city has elected to issue a formal citation to Ms. Bernadette Arnolson under Municipal Code Section 8-14, impeding emergency response. The citation carries a financial penalty and a mandatory appearance in front of a municipal hearing officer. You may be called to testify. Should the hearing officer find additional aggravating circumstances, further penalties may be imposed. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining public safety within our jurisdiction. Sincerely, Cynthia Rivers, Office of Public Safety and Code Enforcement. I exhaled, relief and vindication mingling. Oliver came up behind me, reading over my shoulder. So she's being officially cited, he murmured. At least it's something. Ella, upon hearing the news, pumped her fist in the air. Finally, she said, maybe she'll learn her lesson. I nodded, though a part of me remained cautious. This wasn't a criminal conviction or a jail sentence. It was a municipal citation, likely a fine. But it was formal acknowledgement from the city that Karen's actions were unacceptable and dangerous. I later learned from neighbors that Karen received the letter the same day. Witnesses described her standing at her mailbox, scanning the document, then crumpling it in fury. Word traveled fast. She had a hearing date in 2 weeks, and if the hearing officer ruled against her, she could be slapped with a hefty fine and potentially a public service requirement. For someone so proud and self-righteous, that would sting deeply. Meanwhile, I felt a measure of reassurance. Our ordeal was still fresh and raw, but at least there was a sense of accountability. Knowing that her interference wouldn't vanish into bureaucratic obscurity lifted some of the weight from my shoulders. The next big development came when the HOA board announced a special session to address concerns about Ms. Arnolson's conduct. The official notice read like a compromise between those on the board who wanted her gone and those still tiptoeing around potential legal ramifications. Regardless, it promised a public forum for neighbors to voice their grievances. We gathered in the same clubhouse where the regular board meetings took place. This time, the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. A larger crowd than usual filled the chairs, perhaps 50 or more. Some even stood near the back, eager to see how the drama would unfold. Mr. Holloway, the board president, opened the session. He looked tired, as if the entire fiasco had given him endless headaches. We are here tonight, he began, to evaluate whether Ms. Arnolson's position on this board remains tenable after recent events. We have received a citation from the city and numerous complaints from residents regarding her actions. Karen sat at one end of the table, chin held high. She wore a bright blue blazer, as if dressing for a battle. When it was her turn to speak, she rose to address the audience. This community has standards, she said sharply, her voice trembling with anger. I've always upheld them in good faith. The day of the Harrison fire, I was concerned about excessive road damage, an ongoing issue that the board has refused to properly address. A resident in the crowd shouted, "You put lives in danger." Another added, "You don't own these roads, Karen." She pressed her lips together, forging ahead. If the city truly values safety, they need to invest in better infrastructure. I was attempting to secure a path that wouldn't endanger the rest of us. This has all been blown out of proportion. The Harrisons' fire was unfortunate, but they themselves admitted to having flammable materials improperly stored. Oliver gripped my hand under the table. I could feel him tense with anger. I stood, ignoring my trembling knees. Karen, my family could have lost our home and our lives. while you waved a clipboard at first responders. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Karen shot me a venomous glare. I'm sorry for the damage to your house, Valerie, truly. But can you deny that I've always looked out for the best interests of Sycamore Heights? By trying to keep a fire truck out, someone else hissed. Denise, the stout board member, stood and tapped a stack of papers. We have multiple documented cases, emails, letters, eyewitness accounts, where Ms. Arnolson's compliance checks went beyond reason and into harassment. She's threatened neighbors with fines for minuscule infractions and, in some instances, invented rules that don't exist in our bylaws. Now, we're faced with a municipal citation for something that could have had catastrophic consequences. The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Holloway looked at Karen. We, the board, must decide if Ms. Arnolson's continued presence helps or hinders the HOA's operations. He then asked for a formal vote. The board members, 8 in total, cast their votes in front of everyone. In the end, 6 voted in favor of removing her from the board, while 2 abstained. The measure passed. Karen was effectively stripped of her position as standards compliance officer, a role she had wielded like a personal fiefdom. A small burst of applause broke out, though it was tinged with the awkwardness of the situation. Karen sat in stunned silence, her cheeks blotchy red. She made no attempt to hide her fury, snatching her papers from the table and stalking out of the clubhouse without a word. Outside, a storm rolled in, thunder rumbling in the distance. As the crowd dispersed, I caught fleeting glances of both relief and a touch of pity. Yet for my family, it felt like a step toward closure. Karen might still live down the street, but at least she no longer had the HOA's official backing to torment us. 2 weeks later, we found ourselves at City Hall, waiting outside a modest hearing room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Ella didn't come, as we felt it would be too stressful. Oliver and I sat side by side on a plastic bench, hearts pounding, bracing ourselves to once again confront Karen. We didn't have to testify formally. We were there as potential witnesses. The hearing officer, a middle-aged woman named Ms. Dodson, would review the evidence, consider statements from the fire department, and then decide if Karen should face a fine, probation, or other measures under local ordinances. When we entered the hearing room, Karen was already seated with her lawyer, a stern-faced man in a charcoal suit. She glared at us, but said nothing. Officer Martinez and a fire department representative sat at another table. The hearing began with Ms. Dodson reciting the charges: obstructing emergency personnel and endangering public safety. Karen's lawyer argued that she hadn't physically restrained anyone or used any barriers, and that the delay was minimal. He insisted that Karen had been confused, caught up in the chaos, rather than willfully malicious. Then came the firefighter's testimony. He described how Karen stood in the middle of the street, refusing to move until threatened with removal. He emphasized that in an active fire, every second counts. A short delay could mean the difference between life and death. The hearing officer scribbled furiously in her notepad. Finally, Ms. Dodson asked if there was video evidence. Oliver nodded at me, and I provided the file on a flash drive. She watched the footage, eyes narrowing at the critical moment when Karen demanded authorization. The entire room fell silent except for the faint crackle of the recorded flames. After a short deliberation, Ms. Dodson pronounced her decision. Karen would be fined $2,500 for impeding the firefighters and required to complete community service at a local fire safety education program. While it wasn't the harshest penalty possible, it was significant, especially for someone who prided herself on being a pillar of the community. Karen looked as if she might collapse or explode in rage. Her lawyer patted her arm, probably urging her to keep calm and avoid further outbursts. My legs felt weak with relief. At least there was some measure of justice being served. As we left the hearing room, Karen brushed past us. She paused for half a second, her voice trembling. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You've humiliated me. But I'm not going anywhere. Sycamore Heights is my home, too." Before we could respond, she stormed off. Oliver squeezed my hand. "She can't hurt us now," he murmured. "Not officially, anyway." I nodded, though a part of me still felt uneasy. Karen's words sounded like a warning. Back in Sycamore Heights, we slowly resumed what passed for normalcy. Contractors completed the garage repairs, replaced the scorched siding, and scrubbed the smoke stains from every surface. A fresh coat of paint covered the walls. We managed to salvage most of our furniture with professional cleaning. Little by little, our house became a home again. Neighbors continued to check on us, delivering meals or offering hands-on help. Their kindness reminded me that Karen was the exception, not the rule. The community as a whole wanted to see us recover. Karen's presence remained, though subdued. With her removal from the HOA board, she lost the official capacity to issue fines or warnings. That didn't stop her from glaring daggers whenever we crossed paths. Once, as Ella skateboarded down the sidewalk, Karen appeared at her window, scowling. But without her precious clipboard and authority, she could do no more than watch. One afternoon, as I planted new flower beds where smoke had once blackened the soil, an older neighbor approached. He introduced himself as Ted, a longtime resident. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that nightmare," he said, gesturing vaguely to the repaired garage. "I've seen Karen push the limits for years. No one had the guts to stand up to her. But you did." I offered a faint smile, recalling how terrified I'd been. "We didn't have much choice," I replied. "She nearly cost us everything." Ted nodded. "People like Karen, they thrive on intimidation. But now she's been shown she can't just bully everyone. That's a win for all of us." His words warmed me. It felt good to know that we hadn't just secured justice for ourselves. We'd taken a stand that might protect others from similar harassment. Though we never set out to be the neighborhood heroes, that's how some began to see us. As the weeks turned into months, Sycamore Heights shifted in tone. Without Karen's constant barrage of compliance notices, the community breathed easier. The new compliance officer, selected by the board, approached the job with a more moderate stance, focusing on actual issues rather than petty infractions. Residents felt freer to decorate their front porches or host small gatherings without fearing a scolding note taped to the door. Meanwhile, the footage of Karen blocking the fire truck had circulated among many neighbors. Some had only heard rumors. Once they saw the video, their outrage grew. A petition circulated to have Karen resign from any remaining committees and step back from neighborhood decision-making entirely. Whether out of shame or necessity, Karen began skipping most community events. Our family, though forever changed by the ordeal, started to heal. The nightmares about being trapped in a burning house receded. Ella's anxiety eased, and she found the courage to practice her skateboard tricks again, unafraid of disapproving eyes. Oliver and I finally managed to host a small backyard barbecue, a celebration of sorts, marking our official return to the neighborhood. The turnout was heartwarming, with dozens of neighbors laughing, sharing food, and clinking glasses under a soft summer twilight. Every so often, I'd catch sight of Karen's house up the road. The lights off, the curtains drawn. It felt symbolic. Her era of controlling Sycamore Heights from behind a clipboard had faded, leaving her isolated in her own fortress. A part of me wondered if she felt remorse or if she blamed us for her downfall. Possibly both. Regardless, we forged ahead. Life is too short to spend it fearing the antics of one bitter person. If anything, the near disaster taught me to cherish every moment and to stand my ground when it truly matters. One windy evening in late autumn, I was out for a walk, letting the crisp air clear my mind. The leaves danced in swirling patterns on the sidewalks of Sycamore Heights, painting the neighborhood in shades of gold and red. As I rounded the corner by Karen's house, I noticed her silhouette on the porch, a solitary figure gazing at the sky. She spotted me and froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. The wind gusted, rustling the leaves between us. I considered walking on, pretending not to see her. But something compelled me to pause, to see if there was any chance of reconciliation or at least civil conversation. Karen's expression was guarded, arms hugging her torso, as if protecting herself from the chill. Her posture softened just a fraction. "Valerie," she said, "I've been meaning to talk to you." My stomach tensed. "Okay." She stepped down from the porch, each movement hesitant. "I know you probably hate me," she began quietly. "And I don't expect forgiveness for what happened. But I wanted to say I didn't mean for things to go that far." I studied her face. Lines of stress etched around her eyes, corners of her mouth turned downward. "What did you mean, then?" I asked, hearing the edge in my own voice. Karen swallowed, her voice unsteady. "I was trying to do what I thought was right for the community. I've always believed in maintaining standards. It got twisted. I never wanted anyone hurt." A flurry of memories shot through my mind. The flames devouring our garage, the terror in Ella's eyes, the firefighters yelling for Karen to move. My anger bubbled up again. Twisted? You physically blocked a fire truck, Karen. You demanded they present authorization while our house was burning. That's not about standards or rules. That's about control. Tears glistened in her eyes, though she fought to keep her composure. I know. I lost perspective. I've been on the board for so long, telling myself I was the guardian of Sycamore Heights. Maybe I let it go to my head. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, pity, exhaustion. Karen bit her lip, glancing at the ground. The wind whipped her hair across her face. I've been to 2 sessions of that fire safety program already, she said. I'm required to complete 10 hours total. It's humbling. Silence stretched between us. Finally, I exhaled. Well, I hope you learned something from it. We were lucky. No one got seriously injured. It could have been a tragedy. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. If I could take it back, I would. I stood there, unsure what else to say. Despite everything, it seemed she was offering some form of apology, albeit late and compelled by her punishment. I doubted we'd ever be friends, but I also didn't want to carry bitterness for the rest of my life. Without promising forgiveness, I simply said, "Thank you for saying that." Then I walked away, the autumn wind swirling leaves around our feet. She stayed behind, hugging herself on the curb. That would be our last direct conversation. In the months that followed, Sycamore Heights returned to its tranquil facade. The menacing specter of Karen's HOA reign had faded, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. People decorated for the holidays without fear of receiving notices. The new compliance officer worked closely with residents on friendly reminders rather than harsh penalties. A small but important shift had occurred in the community's culture. Cooperation replaced intimidation. We settled back into our refurbished home. The lingering smell of smoke had finally dissipated. The garage looked better than ever, with updated wiring, new drywall, and improved storage for potentially flammable materials. We took every precaution to prevent another mishap. I even scheduled a yearly inspection with a local fire safety crew, determined never to repeat the mistakes that fed the blaze. Ella excelled in school, her skateboard a permanent fixture in the trunk of our car. Oliver and I found ourselves hosting more gatherings. Neighbors seemed eager to hang out in a stress-free environment. A deeper sense of community formed, uniting people who had once only exchanged passing waves. Karen, meanwhile, stayed out of the spotlight. She performed her required community service and paid her fine. Once in a while, I'd see her walking alone, a far cry from the commanding figure she used to be. Some neighbors pitied her. Others said it was karma. I didn't dwell too much on her fate, focusing instead on the normalcy we had fought to reclaim. The video of her confrontation with the fire truck still existed on my phone and in official records, but I rarely revisited it. It served as a reminder of what might have been had the firefighters not pressed forward. I was grateful every day for their courage and for the support from friends and strangers alike. What started as a nightmare ended in a strange sort of triumph. We not only salvaged our home from the flames, but also contributed to a new era in Sycamore Heights, one less bound by rigid, arbitrary control. And though Karen remained our neighbor, she was no longer our overseer. Over a year after the fire, on a bright spring morning, I sipped coffee on the front porch and watched the neighborhood come to life. Children rode their bikes, dogs trotted alongside owners, and the trees sprouted fresh leaves. A gentle breeze carried the scent of budding flowers. In the distance, I glimpsed Karen's house. The windows were open, curtains fluttering. She had replaced her front hedges with simpler, lower-maintenance shrubs, perhaps a sign of shifting priorities. We hadn't spoken since that windy autumn evening, and I had no intention of reopening old wounds. Instead, I focused on the future. My future. My family's future. Sycamore Heights' future. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand gestures or forced reconciliations. It comes from small steps forward, a sense of safety, a recognition of lessons learned, and a renewed commitment to caring for one another in genuine ways. I finished my coffee and set the mug aside. Oliver stepped out, slinging an arm around my shoulder. Ella shouted from the driveway, eager for us to watch her latest skateboard trick. The sun shone on the new paint job, highlighting the subtle changes in our once-scorched garage. In that moment, I felt a profound gratitude for the firefighters who defied Karen's blockade, for the neighbors who rallied around us, and for the second chance to build a life of our own choosing. The memory of the flames still flickered in the recesses of my mind, but it no longer haunted me. It stood instead as a testament to resilience and the power of standing up when it matters most. Because, in the end, Karen faced the consequences of her reckless control. She incurred not only legal and financial penalties, but also the scorn of her neighbors. Her once unassailable authority evaporated in the heat of her own hubris. And though our home nearly perished in flames that day, it survived, just like we did, rebuilt stronger than before.